And today I will be talking about the first voyage of the East India Company, commanded by James Lancaster. And I will also be talking about Edmund Scott's A Discourse of Java and of the first English factory there. And it's a big title, bigger title. Now they are actually two big topics, right? So it might be, I might not do justice by covering both in one session. It would have been more appropriate if I ran two sessions to cover these two kind of topics. But they are related. They are part of the second one is part of the first voyage. So I thought I'll cover both so that you can see kind of one consequence or leading up from the first voyage of the East India Company. What I will say, I will go into more details, but initially I will just say, the first voyage of the East India Company left England, Woolwich, 1601, 21st February, I think it was 25 February, and the aim was to go to Sumatra, Aceh. The Aceh was ruled by a powerful Sultan, and the English been to that part of the world a few times already, but they have never sort of engaged in trade, and their knowledge of what's where, which ports, which island, are probably limited. So they went to Aceh, and they took a very important letter, from Queen Elizabeth as an introduction, and she wanted to establish a trade treaty, and establish good trading relationship. And then the king of Aceh, Sultan, he also sent back a very big important letter to Queen, appreciating her letter and appreciating the request for the friendship and trading links between the two kingdoms. But when the English got there, they found very little pepper there, right, in Aceh itself. So in a way, James Lancaster was a bit annoyed, bit upset that he couldn't get the pepper that he wanted from Aceh, right? Because Aceh was the most powerful kind of Sultan, powerful of the area, in the area. I'm going to give you more context, to the whole thing, so we can understand this better. Now, why am I studying this subject, right? Why do I want to understand about the first voyage of the East India Company, or that period, or voyages of the East India Company, or Western voyages to eastern countries and eastern seas, and so on. One of the reasons is that when you study history and going by ships, they face lots of problems, and it's like an adventure, and it's really enjoyable, reading and finding out what people did, the problem that they had, how they overcame, and so on. And the other thing is that when you study history like this, you actually then understand the present situation a bit better, because how things what led to what, and also because this history is a lot about human beings enduring hardships and competing and fighting and killing and conspiring, and developing strategies. So you also learn a lot about human nature, and who did what, and you learn lessons from history, and this is very important. So I think you can get a lot of pleasure, learn lessons, and improve your understanding about human nature. England at that time, right? Because there's always a context, why did these people want to go to the east or to the west, West Indies and and Brazil and try to find North America and establish settlement there. Now the English actually lost out. It was the Portuguese and the Spanish who started Western countries voyages to other parts of the world and conquest and so on. So England kind of lost out. So the Portuguese got to India in 1498, and the Spanish got to Americas in 1492, and they became very powerful through the conquest and access to so much resources. The Spanish were more kind of violent, takeover of countries and extracting resources and murdering and looting. While the Portuguese were very different. They were a small nation, and they didn't have big manpower. And also, where they went, like India and Asia, already had big, strong and established civilizations and centrally organized places and so on. So it wasn't easy or maybe the aim was different for the Portuguese. But the Portuguese did establish strong settlements and forts, and from where they kind of ruled the whole of Indian Ocean for a long time before the English and the Dutch appeared, late 16th century, right? Now during Elizabeth's time, the English started to develop ambition, to try and do something about it, the fact that they've fallen behind, and so they started to take the English captains, and supported by the Queen and merchants and all kinds of people, and the English were just starting to venture out to try and see if they can get and find colonies and so on. In 1577, Francis Drake, he was the first English person to circumnavigate the world. So he went down, the South America, where Argentina is, and then all the way around. And en route, he actually went into various Spanish settlements, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean side, because they were not well protected, because Spain never thought there would be any enemies or any potential enemies, right? So Francis Drake went and attacked a lot of many Spanish settlements, and also attacked several Spanish ships and looted a lot of gold and silver and other items. Then he went across and went past Philippines and went to a very small Indonesian island called Ternate, and there I think he did pick up small amount of spices, right? Ternate is famous for cloves, right? So he picked up some spices, but then when he came back to England, he became a hero. I think he was knighted, by the Queen, and I think I was reading that although he did not engage in hardly any trade, mostly looted Spanish ships, the investors made 47,000% profit. I hope I'm correct, right? Yeah, 47,000 pound profit, right? And obviously, then later on, the Spanish got kind of angry. There were other things happened, right? So and the English also attacked in mainland Spain and destroyed many of their ships. I think it was in the early 1580s, and the Spanish wanted to teach the English a lesson, so they organized the Armada, and then they lost. Francis Drake was fighting in the Armada, so was Lancashire, James Lancaster. So there's a lot of people who fought in the Armada, who actually participated in many of the voyages later on. And what the Armada did, because of the English victory, and before the Armada, the English nation wasn't very powerful. Spain was the superpower, and Portugal was also very powerful. The other thing happened is in 1580, the Spain took over Portugal, and there was the Iberian Union, so it became kind of one country. And before that, a lot of spices that Portugal used to bring from the Spice Island in Asia, and so they used to come to England as well, through trade. And many of England's goods used to go to Portugal. But when the union happened, Spain started to put restrictions on the amount of spice that can go to England, and also the English trade, with Lisbon. James Lancaster was actually living and working and doing business in Lisbon at that time. And so I don't have much detail, but they say that he hurriedly left Lisbon, right? So he actually, because he spent many years in Lisbon and worked and lived with the Portuguese people. So he developed a deep understanding of this, Portuguese people, their mentality, their country, and also a lot of information about their shipping, their voyages and so on. So he was quite valuable. Anyway, this gentleman, Ralph Fitcher, he traveled not by the sea. He traveled from here to the Middle East, and then Iran, Hormuz, and from there shipped to Goa. Anyway, so he was actually kept. I think the Portuguese captured him in Hormuz, if I remember correctly, then sent him to Goa to be dealt with by the Portuguese empire's kind of main base, in Goa. And apparently an English Catholic priest who was in Goa at that time helped his release. But what Ralph did, he went around, many places and wrote very detailed accounts of, the cost, the cost of different goods and measures and so on. So he came back. He also went to Southeast Asia. Then he came back 8 years later to England with really detailed information about different forts, different ports, the prices of spices and other goods in different places. So there's a lot of intelligence, right? I'm just going to go a little bit and talk about a few voyages of well, in 1591, James Lancaster was part of a venture. Business people, men in London, sent 3 ships to Asia again. But they but en route, what they used to do, they used to go from here to Table Bay. It was called Saldanha in South Africa, present-day South Africa, which the Portuguese discovered a nice location to rest, to get fresh supplies, right, and recoup. So by the time they got there, a large number of this was an East India Company venture. This was just a venture approved by the Queen, venture, paid for by a group of merchants. So they by the time they got to South Africa, a large number of people died of scurvy disease, right? And there was 3 ships. One was called Penelope, one Merchant Royal, and the other one was Edward Bonaventure. So because a lot of people became sick, they sent back one of the ship, the Merchant Royal, and then the other 2 proceeded, but one got lost and sunk. So the ship where Lancaster was in, Edward Bonaventure, it managed to travel to Penang, present-day Malaysia. And there they actually robbed many Spanish ships, Spanish carracks, and then there was going to be a mutiny, or the crews, they just wanted to go back. But en route, when they were coming back, he decided to go to, Lancaster decided to go to the West Indies. Anyway, then more disaster struck. The ship was lost, and it was a French ship that picked them up and brought them back to England. But then this was the first time the English ship actually, the route that they used later on, went to Asia and learned about refreshing in Saldanha Bay and various other ports that they stopped and became familiar with. James Lancaster went on another trip, but this was in the West Indies, not in Asia. But anyway, so what happened in 1595, the Dutch sent their first ships, first expedition to Asia to get spices under Cornelius Houtman. Do you know Cornelius Houtman?
I think so.
Yeah. So I think there were 5 or 6 ships. So they got to Banten, Banten in Indonesia to get spice. That was the main sort of location or city for spices. So when Cornelius Houtman got there in 1596, he became very angry because local didn't want to trade with him. But he didn't fully understand, because what happened at that time, there was a succession problem taking place in the city of Banten, and people just didn't want to deal with him, and the prices of spice, pepper and things were much higher than what he expected. Then I don't have the detail, but then something happened, and kind of a war developed between Cornelius Houtman and the locals, and they killed a lot of people unnecessarily. The Dutch, they even fired at the King Palace, from their guns from the sea. King Palace is probably about 2 miles or 1.5 miles. I'm not exactly sure from the harbour, from the sea. Then Cornelius Houtman, they moved to Madura, another island in East Java. I've read reports, about when Cornelius Houtman, the expedition, the voyage was near Madura. A lot of small boats came, wanting to sell them, vegetables and fruits and other items, and even the prince of the kingdom came on a boat, to kind of show appreciation and welcome and so on. But Cornelius Houtman, he wasn't sure if there was a welcome or a potential ambush, right? Because it's already done a lot of damage in Banten. So they decided it might be ambush, so best be safe than sorry. So Cornelius Houtman, actually, they blasted, a lot of the ships, small boats, bombarded heavily. Even the prince got killed. But I was reading a report where they said about what they did to the prince, because he had a lot of jewelry, gold and jewelry. So they picked his body and took all the jewelry, and then threw him over to the sea. So within that part of the world, Europeans first kind of contacts with Europeans, Northern Europeans, not the Portuguese, was quite traumatic one. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give you some little bit background of the place that they went, right? So you will understand a bit more about what happened and the account of Edmund Scott. Now, this is Banten, right? And Aceh is somewhere there, where the first East India Company, ship, the place they went, right? Now, this is the Banten Sultanate. So this was the seat of Banten Sultanate, and they also had part of Sumatra, Lampung. Now this was an Islamic Sultanate, right? But they established, the Islamic Sultanate was established in 1527. Before that, this was the Hindu kingdom. If you see Sunda, right, the West Java and Galuh, right, they were sometimes one and sometimes they separated. But this was the Hindu kingdom, right? But the problem started within the Hindu kingdom in terms of succession, because in the ports, some of the small ports, there were traders coming from Gujarat, Bengal, and the Middle East, and they established these small Muslim communities, right? And one of the king, his wife was Muslim, a Hindu king. Whether she converted afterwards or he married a Muslim, I'm not sure. I need to look into. But then her children, son, the firstborn, wasn't allowed to be the what's he called?
Successor.
Yeah,
Successor.
heir to the throne, right? Yeah, because his mother was Muslim, and he also converted to Muslim because of his mother, Islam. So his younger cousin, half brother, succeeded, to the throne. But anyway, so he moved to, I think there, established a little town, and became like important. Then later on, his daughter married the son of his sister. No, his auntie. No, his sister. Sorry, his sister, right? And then, but his sister's husband was Egyptian, right? So they later on established a small sultanate in Cirebon, right? Anyway, so and the Muslim Sultan of Damak, over there, and they were kind of expanding their power. 1527 is the time when they came and took over Banten. Now, the Portuguese were in Malacca from 1511, right? And because the Muslim Sultan of, they were all like different Muslim sultanates, right? The Portuguese of Malacca from 1511. So this was the only Hindu kingdom left in that part of the world. And also in East Java a little bit, you cannot see another bit. So they were interested in making an alliance with the Portuguese, right? Because they were facing threat from the Muslims, right? So they came to an agreement with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were going to establish a base near present-day Jakarta. It was called Sunda Kelapa, right? But then the Portuguese actually needed this to be approved by the authorities in Lisbon. So they waited. But in the meantime, when they got the kind of permission to start, so Portugal sent a fleet from Malacca to come and start the work. But by that time, they actually took over Banten, right? Anyway, so I don't want to go to too much details about this, but it wasn't until about late 1500s, around 1570s, I think, or 80s, that the whole of Sunda kingdom fell to the expanding, Muslim Sultan of Banten. So Muslim Sultan of Banten became this. So when Cornelius Houtman went, there was a succession problem going on. There wasn't between Hindus or Muslim, it was within the kind of Muslim family. And the Muslim Sultan was descendant of the Hindu kingdom. It's the same blood, same kind of people. I think I've already said this before. Right, now about the East India Company. East India Company, when the Dutch came back with not the Houtman's voyage, the one voyage after, I forgot the guy's name, Jack Van something. He came back with a lot of spice, 1599, and then the English kind of panicked. They said the Dutch come back and they will be selling all the spice, right? So then they hurriedly tried to put together a venture, to go to the east and compete with the Dutch and prevent the Dutch from establishing kind of monopoly of spice trade. So they asked Queen Elizabeth for permission. So she granted a charter, and initially it was about 212 people, I think, who joined together, in this venture. And the charter was for 15 years, right? And this charter was to allow this group of business people to have exclusive monopoly of trading east of South Africa. So that's like India and Zanzibar, wherever, and Southeast Asia. The first voyage consisted of 5 ships. So I'm going to go to the next one. I will come back. See, this is kind of the route, the first voyage went. I'm not sure about this one, but then so they started this way. This is Sultan Bay, where they went to refresh, and then they went to Madagascar. There, and from there, these are the routes. They went to Aceh, and then later on, this place called Premiam or something like that, where they managed to get a lot more spices. And this is Banten. Which one? No, they didn't go to Calicut. Calicut is in India. This one?
Yes.
That's Africa. Calicut is there. Right. So the first trip consisted of 5 ships. Right. The first, the flagship, the biggest ship was the Red Dragon. It was 600 tons. Now the Red Dragon was actually built not for East India Company. It was built by a lord who actually built it for piracy purpose. Because that time, the English sailors were actually, as I mentioned earlier, doing a lot of pirating Portuguese and Spanish ships. And this was a big one, very powerful one, 600-ton Red Dragon. It was called something else before, Malice Scourge, I think, and later on renamed as Red Dragon when East India Company bought the ship. Don't know why it was called Red Dragon. Maybe they thought they were going to China or Asia, right? And James Lancaster was command of that ship. So what they used to do, the East India Company voyages, the flagship was called Admiralship, and the person in charge of the admiralship was called General, and the second in command was called Vice Admiral, right? So out of the 5 ships, so Red Dragon was one, and Hector, which were 300 tons, Ascension 260 tons, and Susan 240 tons. Now Red Dragon had 202 people in it. Hector had 108, and Ascension had 82, and Susan had 84. And combined, it's about 480 or something like that. The 5th ship, it was only to help carry additional supplies, right? So I think before they got to South Africa, maybe somewhere here, I'm not exactly sure, that they decided to throw the ship away, just let it go. So took all the goods out, took the sails, took some of the other useful things, and then they just let it go, right? So when they got to South Africa, sorry, I just forgot one thing. I think when they were somewhere here, right, near New Guinea, and they captured a Portuguese ship, and that ship was actually going to Asia, right? And I'll just read out what they said in their journal, right? They said, we took out of her 106 and 40 butts of wine, and 103 score, I don't know what that is, and 16 jars of oil, 12 barrels of oil, and 50 hogs head, and fats of meal, which was a great help to us in the whole voyage after. The general divided this equally, properly, he didn't impartially among the 4 ships. But what I was thinking about is, when This was a much bigger ship, because Portuguese ships were much bigger than the British ships. So they would have had many more men, people in there. So when they took all the, a lot of this item, there's nothing in the journal to say that we left enough for them to survive, So what happened to them, we don't know. Portuguese sources, might have information about some of the ships that they lost or, and they came back. So we don't really know what happened to that. I'm just going to go back to say say something additional. Now, when the ships sailed, you see what happened. The first, when the charter was given, the first 12 voyages were like separate voyages. They were not joint stock. So each voyage was separate. So they raised money from the subscribers for each of the voyages, and then they distributed the profit based on each of the voyages, right? And so that went on for about 12 voyages, right? And after that, they decided that's not a good and economical way, of dealing with things. So then they created what they call joint stock. And for the first voyage, they raised about just over £70,000, which is much more, in today's amount. And the ships that they purchased and the equipment and everything cost them around 40,000. And the provisions, food and other items, about 6,000 for 20 months supply. And then they took bullion, they took silver, Spanish currency, because in the East, it was Spanish currency was like popular, right? In terms of goods, right, they took like iron and tin, wrought and unwrought. What's wrought and unwrought? Anybody knows? Wrought and unwrought, iron and tin.
Wrought iron.
Wrought iron and unwrought.
I think it's processed.
Maybe processed and unprocessed, yeah, probably, right? Then they took 80 pieces of broad clothes of all colors, 80 pieces of Devonshire kerseys. What's that? Some kind of clothes, maybe, yeah? Devonshire kerseys. 100 pieces of Norwich stuffs, and many smaller items and presents for the kings and officers, right? So anyway, they captured a Portuguese ship, and then they came there. By the time they got there, right, a large number of people died of scurvy. I think about more than 100 died. But what they say is that very few people suffered from scurvy in the Red Dragon, in the captain ship, the flagship. And one of the reasons cited was that Lancaster, he gave everybody on board 3 spoonfuls of lemon juice every morning, and then proper food around midday. And it's the vitamin C that prevented the scurvy developing. But most of the other ship, they lost large number of men. So while they were in South Africa, they needed to get fresh supplies, and I'll just read something to you, then I'll explain. Then he himself went presently land to seek some refreshing for our sick and weak men. There he met with certain of the country people, the local people, and gave them divers trifles as knives and pieces of old iron and such like, and made signs to them to bring him down sheep and oxen. For he spake them in the cattle's language, which was never changed at the confusion of Babel, which was mo for oxen and kine and ba for sheep. And the natives understood. So basically, the natives gave them lots of sheep and oxen for little piece of metals and knives and so on. So on the third day, after they communicated this with the natives and gave them some stuff, they brought 1,000 sheep and about 40 oxen. And he's saying the people brought down beefs and muttons, which we bought of them for pieces of old iron hoops, as 2 pieces of 8 inches, a piece for an ox, and 1 piece of 8 inches for a ship, with which they seemed to be well contented. They're very happy. Obviously, they valued that more than, because they probably had plenty. But what I was thinking is, they had 4 ships now, and they had about 400 men still alive. Where would they fit 1,000 ships? And how would they be feeding 1,000 ships? Well, the space. It must have been really cramped. I went to see the Golden Hind. Has anybody seen the Golden Hind in London Bridge? Right, and that was 150 ton ships. And the deck where they have the guns, you cannot stand because it's so short. You get headache. So I don't know how these sailors can operate in.
Was it live sheep? Was it live sheep, or did they kill them?
No, they must have been live, because you wouldn't bring 1,000. Yeah. But they don't give any details, whether they took them on board. But then there were 400 men, so they probably ate quite a few every day. Right? No, they did. East India Company used to carry, live animals. Because I was reading a travel story of someone else, later on in the late 1700s, and he talked about the cows on the ship giving enough milk for quite a few people, including babies, on the ship. But this was like early, journey. So 400 men, they probably had quite a few ships every day. Right? But I was just wondering, because if you take 1,000 ship inside the ship, and you have 400 men, then you would need so much food as well for the ship.
1,000 in one go, or 1,000 over the span of time? So
No, they were not there for very long. It's just refreshing. So they probably had, they were collecting other items, like shells and seal, and shooting deers and antelopes and so on. Anyway, so then they sailed there, but then they got into problem. It was a disaster there. What's it called? It's called Antongil Bay. Anybody heard of Antongil Bay in Madagascar? Right. Again, they went to refresh, get more supplies, fresh water and so on. And when they got there, there was a lot of wood, so they cut some wood because they used to also carry kits for making small boats inside the ship. So they decided to, put the boat together, the kits that they took, but they wanted to give a extra sheeting all around the boat. So they got some local wood. But while they were there, their men started to die from dysentery. They say probably because of the water, the water was a problem. And then also friendly fire. The captain of, I think, Ascension got killed by friendly fire, because when they were, they were showing respect to the dead by firing, and one of the guy hit one of the captains. But anyways, after that they went. They came to Aceh, and I'm just going to say a little bit about Aceh. So they took a letter from the Queen, and the Aceh Sultan, he was actually very, he was waiting to meet English people. Because after the Armada, the English victory, the reputation of England, spread all over. So although the Sultan of Aceh, he didn't know anything about England or much about England, never met an Englishman before, but he couldn't understand how a small nation like that, beat such a big superpower as Spain. Spain's reputation was around for a long time. So when Captain Lancaster, landed, the Sultan of Aceh was very happy, very interested in meeting him, to talk to him. So what happened? There were some Dutch people already there. So the captain stayed on the ship. He sent his second in command, Captain John Middleton, to go and tell the king, that he's got a letter from the Queen of England. And I think it was the next day that he went and stayed in the Dutch house, in Aceh, and from there, some noblemen, came and asked him to deliver the letter. But he said, no, I'm going to deliver myself, right? So he wrapped up, I don't have the details, but wrapped up in silk and in a very nice, flashy way, And then the king of Aceh sent elephants and in a big kind of, what would you say? Anyway, made a big scene to collect him, give him a lot of respect with decorated elephants. So he went and met the Sultan of Aceh, and he gave the Sultan some present. I will just read, I think I got a list of some presents that he gave. Here, then the general proceeded to deliver him his present, which was a basin of silver basin, right, with a fountain in the midst of it, weighing 205 ounces, a great standing cup of silver, a rich-looking glass, a headpiece with a plume of feathers, a case of very fine daggers, a rich wrought embroidered belt to hang a sword in, and a fan of feathers. Okay? So what Lancashire, recorded is that the king asked his people to take everything away, but he kept the fan of feathers, right? Yeah? And he called one of his women, because he had a big harem, right? One of his women to come and fan him while Lancashire was there. And the king gave, the Lancashire some present, which was a white robe of calico, richly wrought with gold, and a very fine girdle of Turkey wort, and 2 cresses, I think daggers, right, which are kind of daggers here, all which a nobleman put in the king's presence. And in this manner he was kind of dismissed with the great courtesies, and then later on, a great entertainment was put. There was a girl, dancing, and in a big feast. And Lancashire, describes how the Sultan, Islamic Sultan, gave him a lot of alcohol, to drink, and he was drinking as well. And Lancashire found the drink too strong, so he asked permission to mix with the water, because it was too strong. And they also mentioned about another sport, they put on for the guests. This is like a tradition of Aceh, where they have in a local river, they have submerged, like chair stools, where guests, they sit, and people come around in a little boat to feed you and give you a lot of alcohol, right? And apparently, according to them, some people died from drinking too much alcohol, right? Anyway, so but then because they couldn't buy enough pepper, there wasn't enough pepper there, so Lancashire had to think, what to do. But in the meantime, what he did was he sent one of his he sent one of the ships with the second in command to go to Priaman or something like that, to procure more pepper, while he planned to go and find some Portuguese ships to take. And the king of Aceh was very interested in him attacking, some Portuguese ships. And there was an ambassador of Portugal at that time, so the king made sure that he didn't leave, and to go and inform the Portuguese of potential problem. But there was a Dutch man there, the Dutch ship. He wanted to join in with the English in capturing a Portuguese ships. And so the captain agreed with the Dutch that he would get 1/8 of the share of the booty, when they go and attack. But while they were going to Malacca, they were in this direction, they did find a big Portuguese ship, and then they circled it, and then they sort of fired cannons, damaged. They didn't want to damage too much because they didn't want to damage the goods, so they kind of disabled it, carefully. And anyway, when they boarded the ship, it took them 6 days, to transfer, because it's a very big ship. I don't remember exactly. I think it does say somewhere. I'm going to find it for you. Say how big the ship was. Yeah. It says within 5 or 6 days, we had unladen her of 950 packages of calicos and pintados. What is pintados? Besides many packets of merchandise, she had in her much rice and other goods, whereof we made full account. Then they experienced a storm, and all the men set abroad, and we left her riding at an anchor. So they left the ship. But they also say that ship had came from a place called Saint Thomas in the Bay of Bengal. It's somewhere, I think, near Madras or that kind of part. So they were bringing a lot of Indian Madrasi textile, maybe. So at that time there was no Madras, right? It was Masulipatam. So this was also a textile, center exporting. So they're probably bringing textile from there. Some textile might have been from Bengal as well, and they say this was going to Malacca, actually bringing the goods from India, going to Malacca. When they intercepted, there were about 600 persons, men, women and children. And it was 900-ton ship. Right? So I was just thinking, what happened to those 600, because they already damaged the ship. So that ship couldn't sail. Don't know how far it was from, probably quite a bit far, otherwise the Portuguese authority would have come to help. So they could have perished, or they could have just floated until somebody saw them, and helped them. So what they did, the large amount of textile they got from the ship was very important for them, because in Indonesia, present Indonesia, people were not interested in British goods, the broadcloths and other items that they took, and they were very interested in Indian textiles. So what they did after they captured the Portuguese ship, they came back to Aceh and to give some gift, to the king, and establish an agreement, and I'm going to just read out a few things from the letter that Queen Elizabeth sent to the King of Aceh. It's very interesting, because then you can think how the English were thinking, at that time, because they were trying to justify their right to trade, because Spain and Portugal, they divided, the wall between them, the European wall between them, and they kind of had exclusive right, the Spain, most of South America and Philippines, and Portugal had right to Brazil and the whole of Southeast Asia except Philippines. But the English were trying to establish their rights, to trade. This is just a little bit from the big letter, and in the letter, there was all this pomp, all these praises, of the king and how important and so on, and also criticized the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Queen says that his creation for the use and nourishment of mankind, the God's creation is for the nourishment of mankind and for the use of mankind, in such sort that notwithstanding they grow in diverse kingdoms and regions of the world, yet by the industry of a man, stirred up by inspiration and of the said omnipotent Creator, they are dispersed into the most remote places of the universal world, to the end that even therein may appear unto all nations his marvelous works, he having so ordained that one land may have need of the other, and thereby not only breed intercourse and exchange of their merchandise and fruits, which do so superabound in some countries and want in others, but also engender love and friendship between all men, and thing naturally divine. So he's basically saying, different parts of the world have been kind of created to provide, to produce different things, have different resources, and so we fulfill our needs by exchanging, and this also brings human beings together, generous love and affections and so on. Then she also says, and now if your highness shall be pleased to accept into your favor and grace, and under your royal protection and defense, these are subjects that they may feel do their business now and continually yearly hereafter. This bearer who goeth chief of this fleet of 4 ships to leave certain factors. Basically saying we would like to leave some people in your kingdom to continue the business and prepare and get to know your country. With a settled house or factory in your kingdom until the going thither of another fleet, which shall go thither upon the return of this, which left factors shall learn the language and customs of your subjects, thereby the better and more lovingly to converse with them. So basically she's saying, look, we want to leave some of our people at the base so they can engage in business and learn about your customs and about your language, so that the whole thing can be deepened. And then there was like subsequent discussion, between Lancashire and the noblemen and the Sultan's court and the Sultan to discuss, what to agree, because they needed kind of an agreement, and what the Sultan was willing to allow the English and so on. So this is what they agreed, right? Sultan might have been a bit silly because he agreed a custom-free business, for the British. I don't know how they charmed, how the English managed to charm the Sultan. Anyway, there are about 7 points or 8 points. One is free entry and trade, right? Second, custom-free, whatsoever they brought in or carried forth, and assistant with their vessels and shipping to save our ships, goods and men from wreck in any dangers, right? Liberty of testament to bequeath their goods to whom they please. And fourthly, stability of bargains and orders for payment by the subjects of Aceh. Fifthly, authority to execute justice on their own men offending. So they won't be under the Sultan's, what's it called? Jurisdiction or no? Yeah. Sixthly, justice against injuries from the natives. Right. So if the natives are so they could demand, the Sultan has to provide the justice if the natives do anything wrong to them. Seventhly, not to arrest or stay our goods. Dispatch the Susan. Dispatch the Susan, the ship. In time. So basically, what happened, and then the Sultan wrote a letter, for the Queen. I don't seem to have it here, but I circulate to people if they want, right? So anyway, the Sultan also wrote a letter, praising, using Islamic prayer type, glorifying the God and the Queen and things like that, right? And then so they left. When did they leave? I think they left in September, and they arrived in they left October, I think. They arrived in Banten in December 2002, right? December 2002. And when they arrived in Banten, the king of Banten, he was only about 6 years old, right? Because his father died in a battle, in 1595 or 6 when Colonel Hootman came. But it was nothing to do with Colonel Hootman because he was trying to take over part of Sumatra, and he died in the expedition. And his young son became under protection from his uncle and other, who acted on his behalf until he come of age. And you can become a king, take full responsibility when you're about 25. So they arrived there, and again, there was a policy that the vice admiral, right, and general, they both will not go, to at the same time land. So one will go, one will stay in the ship, and one will be on board. So the vice general, Captain John Middleton, he went and he introduced and so on. And later on, I think a day later, or 2 days later, Lancashire went to the court, and this general went back. Anyway, he gave a letter to the Queen's letter, to the king, and then king agreed to provide any house that he wants, for the English, and agreed to establish trade. Anyway, by that time, so earlier they already sent one of the ship back, from their Ascension, I think, because it was already, they had enough by that time. So when they came, and what they did, because they had to unload, a lot of the textiles, that they bought. So they managed to get hold of, I think, 3 houses, by the time Captain Middleton kind of left with his fleet back to England. And he left about 22 people or 23 people, about 8 or 9 to stay in the town of Banten, in the factory, look after, their goods and trade, and also procure more goods for the next voyage. What I didn't understand, maybe I don't fully understand, because it was all separate voyages. So why was he spending resources on the first voyage to help the second voyage? So maybe there was some kind of understanding. I didn't kind of go into this one, right? So anyway, so they got agreement, right, with the king. They got 3 houses, and some of the goods that they unloaded, they couldn't. There wasn't enough space, so they used some space in Dutchman's house. They basically got houses not far from where the Chinese were living, because there's a lot of Chinese in Banten at that time, right? And then in February, exactly 2 years after they started their journey from England, they departed. The 3 ships departed. 1 ship already departed earlier, but then they left what they call a pinache, 60 tons, I think, pinache. And they, Captain Lancashire asked the pinache to go to the Nutmeg Island, the Spice Island, the Ternate, Tidore, and Pulau Ran, Pulau Ai, and Amboina, places like that. And because Captain didn't have the time, and he just wanted to go back, he had enough spices. But anyway, he came back in September 2003. About more than 20 months after, I think, 2 years, 7 months after they came back, and they brought back a very large quantity of pepper. But by that time, the King of England, the Queen was already dead. He managed to procure some pepper himself, right, before the East India Company pepper arrived. Then the King forbade the East India Company from selling until he finishes his stock, right? And but then East India Company needed to start another voyage, right, quickly, because the charter said every year they will send a voyage, right? So anyway, I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to now say something about Edmund Scott's account of what he experienced, because Edmund Scott was one of the factors left behind by Captain Middleton, to stay in and look after the affairs and establish trading links. But then soon after the captain left, with his 3 ships, the Englishmen started to die again, of dysentery. There are a lot of people experiencing dysentery. And Edmund Scott was in, before the next fleet came, which was in 1605, right? So about more years, from 11 February until October 1605, they were just there, and men kept on dying. From 20, it became very kind of, it started to reduce. And the person that they left in charge, he also died, I think within few months. I've got the date somewhere here. His name was Starkey. Then Edmund Scott, he became the person in charge. And what he does here, he talks about, I think in the same spirit as earlier, when the Queen said that the men that will leave behind, they will learn your language and your custom. Whether Edmund Scott or anybody in the English settlement, were given instruction to go and research, right, and understand the local custom, local community, and so on. I'm not sure, it doesn't say, but Edmund Scott, he took it as his own responsibility, or some kind of drive or something. He tried to find out about the local situation, local people, local history, local geography, and so on. But what he does, he presents a really kind of horrifying picture, of the life, in Banten. He talks about, how it's a very disease-ridden place, especially for foreigners, right? He talks about Javans. Now, just want to go back a second. Now, this is Java, right? This is Sunda country. They're completely different people. Their language is different. So he talks about Javan. But now at the moment, this is Java-speaking people there, right? But this is, at that time, there would have been very few Javans, probably, in that part. But maybe because the island is called Java, so he just referred to them as Javan, but they were Sundanese people. They've got completely different language and culture, right? He describes, the city of Banten. He says 3 miles long. It's totally, on the one side is the sea, right, Java Sea, and on the other side is surrounded by a wall, right, built a wall-like wall. So they had like forts, it was to protect from outside invasion and so on. And within the city there were many rivers, many waterways that you can go. And he talked about if people are a bit more like enterprising, they could build this in a very important city, right? He talks about this, then he talks about the food, what kind of food people eat. He said the Javans, the local people, they don't eat much meat, like beef or like sheep. They mostly live on, like roots and vegetables, and sometimes some chicken and some fish. I'm a bit surprised because it's near the sea, right? Yeah? So there would be a lot of fish there. When I went for a trip recently, I saw a lot of fishermen. Right? So he said, but this was like not them. And houses, right? Most of the houses were built by bamboo. He talks about great canes, but some are built with the timber as well. And some rich people, they build brick house in the middle of the courtyard, not to live in it, but when if there's fire, so they can put some of their goods for protection. There's a lot of Chinese people who live in the city. There's a Chinese town, and Chinese town is divided with the Javans by a kind of narrow river. And he says various things about the Chinese people. He said Chinese are crafty like the Jews, right? Yeah, they take the money, they send all the money back to China, right? And he said the Chinese people are very enterprising. They run most of the businesses. They run the pepper plantation, and they grow the rice and everything. The Javans are lazy. They don't do any work. They sit down. They carry the daggers, right? Yeah? And the Javans are very proud people, and they have 3 wives and 40 concubines, right? And for every wife, they have 10 slaves, right? And he talks about the Chinese people are atheists. Very few of them believe in any religion. And but when he asked the Muslims, the Gujaratis, right, and the Arabs about what the Chinese believe, Gujaratis and the Muslims say the Chinese believe in devils, right? Then Scott writes that if they believe in devils, they are ashamed to admit it, right? And he also talks about the Muslim belief he says that the principal people are very religious, yet go seldom to church. It probably means most. They acknowledge Jesus to be a great prophet called Nabu Isa. The common people have very little knowledge of religion, only saying that there is a God who made the heaven and the earth. And he thinks, assuredly, if they were men of learning and having a sufficient knowledge of their language to instruct them, many of these ignorant people might be drawn over to true Christian faith. What I'm going to do now, I'm taking too much time, I think. I'm just going to go and explain to you. So basically what Edmund Scott was saying, it was a very dangerous place to live. There were thieves around everywhere, and there were a lot of fires, and the English were targeted, right, by the local people. And sometimes some friendly locals told them the locals might murder them to steal their goods, because there are lots of goods in the town. There's a lot of things he writes, right? Very interesting, but I wouldn't have time to go through this. I'm just going to share, two things that two things in what he writes about his experience. One is that he couldn't understand the hostility, towards the English from the local people. Then, one day he or his friends or colleagues, they thought that perhaps they're mistaking us for the Hollanders, for the Dutch, because it's the Dutch who have been committing a lot of, who've committed, crimes and injustice to local people, starting with Cornelius Houtman, who really savaged the town, in 1596. So what Edmund Scott did, on a day when it was Queen's birthday, they decided to get all the English people to dress up and put the St. George's cross in a map on top of the building, and dress in their kind of English uniform, and march along the town because they didn't have too many men, so they had to march single row, and then after a while, people start asking, "What's this?" Right? And the king's representative came. So, "What are you doing?" And they said, "No, we are commemorating or celebrating our Queen's birthday." And they also fired some, because they had weapons, they were allowed to have weapons. And the king's representative was so impressed. The Queen is so far away, and they still celebrate the Queen's birthday. This, according to Edmund Scott, he could be making this up to impress his people back in London, right? And then some people say, "How come the other English are not celebrating?" So they say, "No, they're not English. They're different. They don't have a king, right? They run by some governors. They don't have a monarch, right?" And according to Edmund Scott, after that, people realized that there were two different kind of people. So children were going around the street shouting, "Orang Inggris baik, Orang Holland jahat." I mean, English people are good, Dutch people are criminals. This is, I'm not saying anything about you, right? I mean, this is, this is like his account, right? Yeah. The other one is really horrifying. So what happened? And then he narrates the story of a Chinese guy who turned Javan. I don't know what he means. A Chinese who turned Javan. He did mention that some Chinese have become Muslims. Whether he meant by Chinese becoming Muslim, right? I'm not 100% sure. But he said a Chinese who turned Javan. He built a house not very far from where their warehouse was. Where they had all the goods. And they said they had two houses. One was where they were brewing this arak, this strong, local alcohol. And the other house is where they used to entertain, and people used to go and drink, alcohol. And one day, I think about night, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, whenever it was, they smelled some fire. So they went out to investigate, and they couldn't kind of find, and they looked around. They went to their warehouse, but then they discovered smoke was coming from the warehouse, right? And then what they did, where the smoke was coming, they also had gunpowder, right? So they quickly moved the gunpowder and moved a lot of a lot of other goods, from the warehouse. Later on, they discovered, after somebody kind of helped them or informed them that the Chinese built a tunnel, to go inside the English warehouse to rob, the goods, right? And the house was built, this arak, this alcohol making factory was built as a show, but the Chinese actually planned to rob the English. So what they did, when the particular room, where the goods were, where the Chinese tried to, go up, they had a floorboard. So at night, the Chinese, they've been digging for a while. When they got there, then if they were going to cut through the floorboard, then it would make noise, right? This is what Scott is saying. I don't know how feasible, all these things are, but because it was going to make noise, so the Chinese decided to burn it, the floorboard, right? And then that caught fire, and they were like carpet or whatever linked to bales, Bales is what this container, isn't it? Anyway, so that caught fire, right? Yeah. Anyway, so they managed to put out the fire, but then when they were informed that they heard that some Chinese dug a tunnel, then the governor Edmund Scott, he went with few other people, his own English resident of Banten, to the Chinese house, and some of them actually fled. And he caught some, and then some fled. But I'm going to read something to you which you might find horrifying. If you can leave the room if it might scare you, right? Yeah, what he says, right, if they just went a little bit further, right, because the English people, they dug, inside their own warehouse, they dug a ground, on the ground, and they buried 30,000 pieces of 8, it's Spanish currency, right, so that, people don't steal. Right, okay. Next day, the Javan admiral took one of the incendiaries. He's one of the guys, who tried to lit fire, who was found in his privy. This was he who put fire to our house. He confessed to the admiral that he had clapped many reals and had counterfeited some. He even confessed some things concerning our matter, but not much, and would tell us nothing. Because of his obstinacy, and that he had set house on fire, I caused him to be burned. That's Edmund Scott saying, by means of sharp iron thrust under the nails of his thumbs, fingers, and toes, and the nails to be torn off. And because he never flinched, if you're doing that, you must, I don't know. We thought his hands and feet had been benumbed with tying. Therefore we burned him in other parts, as the hands and arms, shoulders and neck, but even this had no effect. We then burned him quite through the hands, and tore out the flesh and sinus with rasps, causing his shins to be knocked with hot searing irons. I then caused cold iron. Screws to be screwed into the bones of his arms, and suddenly snatched out, and to break all the bones of his fingers and toes with pincers. Yet all this never shed a tear, neither once turned his head aside, nor stirred hand or foot. Do you think this is believable? But when we asked him a question, he would put his tongue between his teeth and strike his chin on his knees to bite it off. After using the utmost extremity of torture in vain, I made him to begin laid fast in irons, when the ants, which greatly abound here, got into his wounds and tormented him worse than we had done. So might be seen by his gestures. The king's officers desired me to shoot him to death, which I thought too good a death for a villain. But as they insisted, we led him into the field and made him fast to a stake. The first shot carried away a piece of his arm, bone and all. The next went through his breast near the shoulder, on which he bent down his head and looked at the wound. At the third shot, one of our men used a bullet cut in 3 pieces, which struck his breast in a triangle, on which he sunk as low as the stake would allow. Finally, between our men and the Hollanders who joined in as well, he was shot almost to pieces. Right? There is other account of torture as well. Right? So basically, what he was saying was a very horrifying experience, right? And from his experience or fear of crime, he made a lot of kind of judgment about the local community, local people, which had a long-term impact on how the English kind of viewed, the people in that part of the world. They also had problems with the Dutch, the quarrels and fights and so on. I'm actually won't say anymore. It's taking too much time. I will end here, but just want to say that. But what he also does say at one point is that things are getting better, right? And he's only been here 2.5 years. Sometimes we go to a city, we might experience a lot of fear of crime because and other people don't experience, but we can experience. But the context of the time, there was a rivalry going on, and there were kind of a lot of in history, local context, right? And there was rivalry between the Hollanders, and also just 1 year before the English came to Banten, there was a war between the Dutch and the Portuguese. When the Dutch destroyed the Portuguese fleet, a large Portuguese fleet off Banten in 1601. Anyway, so Captain Middleton came in the second voyage of the East India Company, Henry Middleton. The first Middleton, John, he died on board of dysentery and fever, soon after they arrived in Banten. And then Scott, he went back to England. There is not many discussion about Scott's account of life in Banten, but I have seen few, and in one of the discussions they were saying that perhaps he was trying to impress, his people here back in England, what he did, the efforts he made to protect, the English goods and English pride and English, English reputation. Thank you very much. Any question? Anything?
I've got a very basic one, which was, what languages did they use to communicate?
Right. The East India Company, they used to take people with them, who can speak Arabic, Portuguese. I believe there was one Jewish guy as well in the company of Lancashire. I was reading something. It says that he's the one who helped translate, the Arabic to the Sultan of Aceh. And that particular Jewish guy, he's from North Africa, but he was picked up by the English a few years earlier, and he lived in England for a while. But he knew Arabic because he was from North Africa. So he was in the voyage, but apparently he sort of escaped from Captain Lancashire when he was in Banten, and he made his own way somewhere else, and met up with the French fleet somewhere in Maldives or somewhere later on. I think Portuguese was the lingua franca, and Captain Middleton, Lancashire knew Portuguese because he was in Lisbon. He lived there for a long time, and Portuguese was quite widely spoken, understood. In the Sultan's court, of course, Arabic, but then Malayu, the what you call Bahasa Malay, that was widely understood, in all the port areas. But I don't know at that time whether any English people knew, but then Portuguese would have been enough, and Arabic.
When you say things were getting better, so you said, what criteria of measure was it based on?
I think he was just, there was no he wasn't giving like a fear of crime or crime statistics that reduced by 20% or whatever. I think it was on feeling. But what he does say is that one of the reasons is because the king is getting older. But by 1605, the king would have only been about 9 years old, whereas when he first arrived, he would have been about 6. What I think is, but one of the steps that they took is to differentiate themselves from the Dutch. So any wrong that the Dutch does to the local people will not, and they will not face any revenge from the local people, and that's what he's trying to say. What was also interesting for me is that he took a long time, or a lot of efforts to try and understand the local custom. He describes in detail, the kind of dresses the women wear, the men wear, the Chinese, the local Javans, what their dresses are like. And he also talks about, he's never been because it's too far, in the central areas of Java, very few people live. There are hills, mountain, but not very big, so people can go there. And he heard reports that wild animals, live mostly on the hills and the central areas, and they come to coastal town and attacks human beings every now and then. But I think he probably started to feel a bit more kind of secure. At first, he found the situation horrifying, but also because there was problem like Cornelius Houtman devastated the town in 1596, and there was a power struggle going on, and there were also there was an invasion, headhunters from somewhere in Sumatra. He mentioned Lampung, but Lampung was part of the Sultanate, so I don't know where the headhunters came from, because they were told that the king or the Sultan who sent the headhunters right here to Banten, so if they could kill somebody, take their head, then they could get a slave woman for them. The king would give them a slave woman. So the incentives to come and kill people, they take their head. And he mentioned that some people, because they couldn't kill, so they got heads from the grave and pretend that they kill. So they take to get slave women back where they come from. But he also says that if the Chinese, they civilized these people, because before the Chinese came, they were cannibals.
How long did he stay there? And how does it lead on to the expeditions to India and gradually settling?
You see, initially they were not interested in India. They were interested in spice, and India was not known in Europe for spice. Although India had spices, so they wanted to go and get pepper, and nutmeg was. I was reading somewhere, nutmeg was more expensive than gold in weight, right? And in England there were books printed, about the cures, that nutmeg can generate, and also preserving food and so on. And by the time they started to go to the east, pepper became like a necessity. People couldn't eat their food without pepper, so they couldn't live without pepper. And the restriction that were imposed, by the newly united Iberian Peninsula, so they had to go, and the Dutch went there because they don't want to pay the Dutch too much price. But in terms of India, so what happened when they got to those places, they realized nobody was interested in English clothes. They took with them to establish trading links with the Mughals, and establish trade agreement, with the Mughals, William Hawkins. And while he was there, the Mughals forced him to marry a woman, because they kept him there for a long time. He married an Armenian woman, Armenian Christian. They went to India to get Indian textiles, and to exchange Indian textiles for spices. That's how the kind of trade started. But what happened later on, it's all kind of linked. I just said that Hawkins married that Armenian woman, but then when he went to go back, he took the woman with him, and then he died. And then a man called Gabriel Towerson, who succeeded Edmund Scott in Banten as the governor, he married her, right? And then later on, he took her to Agra. Then he abandoned her. Then he came back. Then he was killed by the Dutch in 1623 in Amboina.
Were they, they were facing resistance from the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Banten tribes. Do they have native pirates sort of lurking around the waters ready to attack the merchant ships?
When I was reading this account, it's more like the English were the pirates, right? in those part of the world, right? No, I think. So what I'm just guessing this. The Portuguese, when they came, they destroyed, any power of any kind of significance, in the Indian Ocean, right? And when the English came, their ships were too big, The pirates, small, tiny ships, they couldn't take, right? And the English ships were. No, I have not read, but it's what happened. They were like, say, Sultan of Aceh, the previous Sultan. He did try to take over Malacca from the Portuguese, and he failed. But in terms of local pirates attacking, European ships in Asia, I haven't heard. I haven't read anything about it.
I just want to know, India was the main attraction for the Europeans to go there. Vasco da Gama, Columbus wanted to go there, and he couldn't even have the bloody ability. He went to the United States instead, lost. And you mentioned Ralph Fitch. Fitch went because with the Queen Elizabeth's letter to Akbar, the England wants to start business in India. And Akbar was the emperor there, the great emperor. Fitch, you are absolutely right, Fitch was arrested in Goa, and his friends, Newbury, Leeds, and Southgate, or four of them from Aleppo, they were in Basra. From Aleppo, they went straight to India.
Hormuz, I think, first.
1602.
First to Hormuz, I think. No, earlier.
Aleppo to Basra, Basra to India they went. But Aleppo, they spent a lot of time in Aleppo. Aleppo is the center of the whole international kind of thing. And the whole thing started. He had a letter from the Queen to Akbar, but Akbar said, "Who is Queen of England?" That was after Armada. So he didn't give them any audience. They didn't get any audience. So, so he stayed on in Goa, and one of them, Newbury, became a monk. India was always the center of attraction. Sultanate took the letter and all these things. Akbar completely ignored. So this is the whole idea. India was the main center of attraction. Even the Romans and the Greeks started, thinking of that. So what Anne is asking, what happened to this group? And the guy, the Dutch guy, Hollander, Jan van,
that's the one.
his book, in 1592 to 96, he stayed in Goa. He wrote a book, and that became the incentive for Europeans to go. And he said, the Portuguese are very weak, you can take over. And the Dutch East India Company went there because they got the whole charter for the thing. So I just want to know why they got stuck in a small place like Java and Borneo and all places.
You see, all the intelligence, right? Because the English wasn't familiar, with with Asia, with Southeast Asia. There were one or two people, went like Victor, Ralph, and so on. But the Portuguese were going there for nearly 100 years, and they were bringing back, the spices and the textile from India. And India also had pepper, right? But nutmeg, nutmeg and cloves and large amount of pepper were being grown in Indonesian island. They became known in the West as Spice Island, right? And England at that time did not develop taste for Indian textiles, right? So for England, in terms of what they needed that time, what they wanted, the India wasn't really an attraction, the main attraction, right? But they were looking for opportunities to trade as many places as possible. But at that moment, when the East India Company started, they were facing this competition with the Dutch. But the Dutch just came back, with a lot of spices. And if they don't go themselves, then they'll have to buy from the Dutch, and it's going to be very expensive. And the Dutch going to become very rich, right? So the English hurriedly, put together an expedition. And because Lancaster has already been there to Penang near, so they learned, a bit about the Asian waters and so on, and learn a little bit about the kind of Asian people, navigation, and so on. And then Ralph also came back earlier. I don't know when he came back. He came back after 8 years with lots of detailed information. The other thing I want to say is that I think his name is John Davis. He was a navigator, He was also in Cornelius Hoodman's expedition. And he came back and he had detailed knowledge of ports, where things were sold and so on. It was because of his knowledge or his reports, right? They targeted Aceh first, and that's why the Queen's letter to Aceh is a bit more pompous, and the effort that they made, the present that they gave to the King of Aceh, but there was nothing there, so they really then they established a factory in Banten, and the Banten factory became the East India Company presidency, and it was the main headquarter of East India Company operation in Asia for 82 years. But in between, sometime Banten was downgraded, and Surat, they made Surat as well, I think 1623 or something for some reason. Then they went back to Banten again. And then they established, the base they established in Madras, it's from Banten. And they also established a base in Bengkulu. I went to Banten recently, but I couldn't find any trace of any English buildings or any English settlement. But in Bengkulu, they still have a lot of English ruins, but Bengkulu was founded later than Banten. So I think India would have been important, but immediately what they were looking for, the competition they faced, that's what I think drove them to go to Asia. And the spices were very expensive. And then when, initially they went to India to get Indian textiles. But then when they started to bring some textile back to London, and when people became mad about Indian textile, and by that time the Dutch kicked the English out of the whole Indonesian area. From Ambon, they killed some English people. Then English focus went into India, right? And the textile, demand for textile was like unlimited. What's the word?
Insatiable.
There was no limit. But pepper, there's limit, isn't it?
To ask about the letter from the Queen, did the other powers like the Dutch and the Portuguese, did they have that kind of approach to settling their people and having these quite very formal agreements with the local rulers, where they are their own jurisdiction and things like that? I mean, this is a very English approach, or was it similar to what the other powers were doing?
I haven't read accounts of Dutch or the Portuguese, when they Portuguese initially was different, because when they went, right, they start fighting from day one. The Portuguese start causing problem, and the way they moved and took Malacca, Goa, and Hormuz, it was like a strategic plan. They wanted to capture some places to control the whole of spice trade, right? But I'm sure, they were like, because the Dutch, when they went to establish trading links, not to conquer, initially.
Learn the language, learn the customs of the people, have a settlement, spend time there. It's not just trade.
No, you will always find some people, because see, by the time the Dutch and the English, people could speak Portuguese. A lot of people in the East could speak Portuguese. It was the lingua franca. And many, even Hootman, Colonel Hootman, he was a spy in Lisbon for many years. Right, so learning, getting information, learning about the Portuguese trade and ships and so on. So there's a lot of spying going on, and there were, people in England who could speak Arabic, who knew Arabic. So there were. It's not that suddenly you just put them there, then they have to learn the language. There's always people, who spend some time, learning or getting familiar with customs of another place.
Can I just say, I was at an exhibition in Rivington Place that's just started the other day by a Portuguese guy, and he was saying that the throne of the King of Congo is still in Lisbon because the King of Portugal declared a permanent relationship with him, converted him to Catholicism. So this was sometime previously, but the Portuguese certainly had that relationship in other places, and had those settlements and built up very long-term relationships.
Yeah.
The Portuguese started Christianity to find Christians. That was the whole intention. Long before 1502. 1498, they were going to find Christians in India, and of course, Columbus tried to butcher people and others, but that was the whole intention. In India, 1510, they captured Goa to establish a Christian kingdom, and Fish was, because he was a heretic, he was a Church of England. That's why he was Inquisition set up for all his mates.
And also the Portuguese, their intention was not only trade, but the English, they didn't seem to be interested in promoting Christianity. There might have been individual, but there was no policy. But the Portuguese were more, they had this Christianizing kind of mission. And if you even read, Al-Bukhari, sounds like Arabic name, but he's a Portuguese. He's nothing to do with Arab. He's the general who captured both Goa and Malacca, definitely. And he tried to capture, I think he captured, did he capture Goa? Anyway, so he captured Malacca. And on the eve of the expedition to Malacca, he gave a speech, to his people. Then you can see what the strategy he was following. I don't have this speech with me, right? It's kind of interesting. It was to starve off the Muslims, of trade and money resources, because through the Malacca Strait you had a lot of trade from China and a place going to India and Middle East, and from India to then the other way around, right? Yeah? So the strategy was to choke them off. So that's why they took Hormuz, Iran, so that spices, they couldn't, trade cannot go without them into the Middle East. And then Goa was a little bit accidental, I think. It wasn't a very strategic. They were encouraged by some renegades or some people in the area, doing some kind of issue, right? But they tried to take the Red Sea port, Aden, but they didn't manage, and so they never got it. But then from the Malacca, they control in the whole kind of trade coming. But because of that also, then some trade got diverted, to Banten. And the Portuguese used to go to Banten, to buy a lot of spices. This was one of the reasons also Banten became very big, very rich. So the other thing I want to say, Banten.
Population of Banten, how big?
Well, Scott talks about, right? He says, I think about 100,000 people at that time, which is quite big, right? His estimate, who knows, right? It was very busy. There were 3 markets every day. The morning market was big as any market in England, right? and what they used to sell in the market and so on. The Chinese, they used to cultivate, in Sumatra as well, the pepper, right? From there, Chinese used to deal with most of the trade. The other thing I want to say, what he said that every year big junks come from China with porcelain and a lot of other goods. So this became a very big center of trade. Different nations coming, they're buying and selling, bringing their goods, and that also gave money to the coffers of the Sultan. And then, there's this, what's the word? Positive chain, there's another word, multiplier, right? Effect, right? And the other thing he says is that the Chinese, they take local wives, right? When they're there. But when they go back to China, they don't take their wives back. They take their children back. They leave the wives, right? Yeah. And they say when the Chinese die, they this is what Scott's saying. He might not be true in everything. He might be generalizing. When the Chinese die, their ashes, they send them back to China in the next junk, right? To be, put near their ancestors or whatever, right? And and there's so many. It's a good thing and bad thing about the Chinese. They're very enterprising, but they're very cunning as well. You can't trust them. They're thieves as well. They're digging tunnels.
What was the local reaction to the torture and punishment of that individual? Did the locals know, or was it confined to the British and the Dutch knowledge about
No. I think it was meant for the local to know,
Yeah,
so that
what was their reaction to that?
I have no idea. I'm sure they got scared, right? And the English became safer. Like he's saying, things improved.
Right.
So possibly because of.
Who was doing the torturing?
Oh, sorry, I didn't. I should have made it clear.
No, you did, I'm sure.
See what happened? The English house, right? Somebody tried to burgle the English house.
Was it the English and Dutch who were doing the torturing, or was it the Javanese to help them?
No. The English. He said he himself. The English person in charge, Edmund Scott. He's saying he himself did all this torturing.
It's very interesting because there's always been a tradition of Chinese tortures being the worst in the world, and yet we're hearing about European torturers topping them. So.
England torture always been there, witchcraft, and if you read the history, it's the most brutal torture in the world.
Okay, before you go, just one thing, Deepak.
The witchcraft.
Just before you go, can I just suggest something to people? Hello, excuse me. Hello, excuse me. Just like to suggest something. These are really interesting. You will enjoy just reading them, right? But then reading them, you learn about the historical kind of things that led to where we are now. Right? So it's really important, right? So do read, the old stuff in the library. British Library got many things, and you'll get a lot of pleasure and also a lot of knowledge and understanding. Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you.
Yes,